Welcome to the World Lens podcast, where we look at what's happening around the world each week through a global business lens. I'm your host, Michelle Evans, digital specialist at the World Trade Center Institute. So on Tuesday at approximately 1:30 a.m., the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore was struck by a massive cargo ship and collapsed. As of the recording of this podcast, 6 individuals are still unaccounted for and are presumed dead. Our hearts go out to those whose lives have been impacted by this tragedy. While the impact of this tragedy is only being felt, it is clear that this will have economic ramifications for Baltimore and the United States. Today, we are joined by Peter Bowe, publisher of DredgeWire, a leading digital newspaper for people in the maritime, dredging, and related industries. He's also the founder of the Peter Bowe and Barbara Stewart Foundation and served for almost 40 years as the CEO of Ellicott Dredges, the world's leading manufacturer of portable dredging equipment. Welcome to the podcast, Peter. How are you?
Thanks, Michelle. It's great to be with you, even though it's a very sad topic.
Right.
And I should add at the beginning, it's somewhat of a miracle that so far there's no reports of casualties from cars falling in the water, and that's the result of an amazingly quick response by the local authorities to shut the bridge down.
Right.
And if it ends up that no one died from cars, that's just truly a miracle, as the governor has said.
I agree. So much of your career has been spent in manufacturing, specifically dredging equipment. I would imagine that some of that equipment is either en route or on site at the bridge right now. Is that the case?
Actually, no. Ellicott, which is still based in Baltimore and has been for over 100 years, made dredging equipment, sucking up dirt from the bottom of the sea like a floating vacuum cleaner, if you will. Mm-hmm. The project at hand now is to recover the structures at the bottom and eventually rebuild a bridge. That's going to involve lots of cranes and specialty barges. It's not in Ellicott's wheelhouse, so to speak. But I've heard already that some crane vessels are en route to this site to start cleaning it up when the accident scene is closed.
So removing the debris from the water has to be a massive undertaking. How long is something like that going to take?
Well, no one knows any of these timelines for sure, and I would be speculating, but I would think that in a month they will make a lot of progress cleaning out the debris. And once they get mobilized, things can actually start to happen quickly. But of course, they have to extricate the ship, which is in an environmentally safe fashion. That's an unusual task, to say the least. We've all seen the pictures with the dredge structure on top of the ship, but I think you'd see progress, a lot of progress in a month removing the structure.
So once everything is cleared out, does that mean that the waterway is safe for boats to start going in and out again?
Well, I would say yes, and the question is how long will that take? And I think if they got it done in 60 days, that would be completely for navigation to resume. That would be remarkable. Maybe 3 months, but that's certainly a very long time for the transportation infrastructure to be interrupted. So, anything you couldn't plan for less than 90 days to accomplish that.
Right. So halting all the imports and exports through the Port of Baltimore for the time being, how is that going to work with other companies who have already planned to go there? Have they already rerouted to a different port?
Well, there's a sort of a short-term crisis and a medium-term just craziness. Actually, the Port of Virginia has already offered to help and says it has extra capacity. That's certainly significant, but you have to consider the kinds of activities that the Port of Baltimore specialized in, which is coal and most importantly cars, exports of transportation equipment. Cars themselves take a lot of space, a lot of land. Literally, you also look like parking lots of cars. Right. Not every port can just jump in and take up that slack. So I don't know how much land they have. And of course, Baltimore was big in containers, which the container ship caused the accident. So not all ports is the same as the answer to your question. And people will be scrambling to figure out alternate routes.
So are we looking at a greater lead time on cargo, different tax situations?
Oh, for sure. People have counted on the specialty services that Baltimore offered. Some people, there'll be a variety of crises that you can imagine. Let's say that you've got the Domino sugar plant in the Inner Harbor that says they have several weeks supply of sugar cane, but what happens if the shutdown continues for months? they're going to run out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be just a single example. I mean, the consequential damages flow on in ways you can't even imagine. Suppose you were a Baltimore exporter shipping something through the port, and you had a letter of credit for your goods, which requires a latest bill of lading date. That means you have to ship by a certain date,
Mm-hmm.
otherwise your payment mechanism disappears. That would be just a mess for lots of people. There will be consequences for many months to come on this.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you said probably 60 to 90 days for it to reopen. What are the chances that these temporary changes end up becoming permanent? What does that do for the Port of Baltimore?
And by the way, I would say 3 to 6 months for cleaning it up. Anytime in that range would not be a surprise.
Mm-hmm.
The port will get going again once when the shipping is open again. That will solve a lot of the problems, probably most of the problems. Certainly, local commuting traffic aside, there will be longer truck times to get around, but it's certainly getting that's not as bad as the absence of an unavailability of shipping service. So long-term consequences, I think that the Port of Baltimore will do fine. Rebuilding the bridge itself is a gigantic and time-consuming project. I said rebuilding the bridge, yeah, will be slow.
Yeah, like once everything is cleared and back up again, it won't go back to business as usual automatically. What's the process of getting these things going again?
Well, I mean, the Port of Baltimore existed for 200 years without a key bridge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the key bridge is 50 years old. The port's 250 years old. So it will be a drag, but the port will do just fine once the shipping channels are restored. So that's the key. Uh, there'll be inefficiencies until that bridge is restored, and realistically, that's at least I'd say 4 years to get a bridge like that back up and going. Could be longer.
Yeah, I think it was maybe 5 years or so originally when it was built.
Right. Yep. And a lot of it will be depend on things like permitting. When you think about how long you've got design, and it'll be redesign and re-permitting, and there will be accelerated measures taken. When the I-35 bridge fell in Minneapolis, which was a terrible thing and it
Mm-hmm.
killed people, it wasn't a consequence of being hit by something. It was rebuilt in just over a year, when normally environmental permit alone would take longer than a year. So
Wow.
there'll be accelerated efforts put on this, but it's still way too early to tell whether it's 4 years or 6 years to rebuild it. And of course, that assumes there's funding. And I think, based on the assurances from President Biden,
Mm-hmm.
funding is the least of the problems at this point.
And what about insurance?
Well, that is a crazy topic. Just by contrast, when the Suez Canal was closed by the Ever Forward thing, which also was Maersk, I heard that insurance settlement on that was over $500 million.
Wow.
When there was a ship that ran aground last year in the Chesapeake Bay, ironically, and the state had to take over getting that ship out. I think the state has claimed over $100 million for that incident. But it's reported that this is likely to be the most expensive marine insurance catastrophe in history.
Wow.
And that there are, all these different insurances are involved: property, cargo, liability, trade credit relates to the letters of credit, business interruption. I mean, there's just so many different layers of insurance, of types of insurance. Interesting statistic, Maersk, the big European shipping company that chartered the ship,
Mm-hmm.
their stock price fell by over $4 billion in the last 24 hours.
Ooh.
It's a $130 billion market value company. It's one of the biggest shipping companies. So that's just an initial assessment by the investors on the impact of this thing. There are many let's say culpable parties, and it'll take a year for the National Transportation Safety Board to issue a report, which will assign fault and say what could have been done differently, what should have been done differently.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, I'm sure the feds and the state will pay for things to happen, and there'll be years of litigation over insurance. But again, the expectation is it'll cost the insurance cost will be over $1 billion, and I think the dredge the bridge itself will cost over $1 billion to rebuild. And something that's worth mentioning is that inflation in construction
Yeah.
has been enormous in recent years. So, if it costs $3 billion to rebuild, I wouldn't be surprised.
Sheesh. So, like you mentioned, the local impact. It's estimated that 140,000 jobs are connected to the Baltimore port. What do you think will happen with the people who were depending on that for their livelihood now that the port is closed temporarily?
Well, that's serious for sure. I mean, it's my understanding that the longshoremen, the people that load the ships, they're highly paid, skilled people, but they get paid only when they work. So if
Mm.
they're not working, they won't get paid. There'll be immediate impact there. I imagine that eventually they'll be made whole through the various responsible parties. I think in the immediate short term, though, there'll be some, unless the state steps forward with some special arrangements, there'll be some people hurting. Uh, so it's going to be difficult to sort out. The good news is that certainly all the authorities involved, and there are many, whether it's the feds or the Port of Baltimore, that people recognize these costs. And I think certainly the governor will lead an effort to make sure that those people are taken care of. We can only hope.
Yeah, I thought, how President Biden mentioned that they would cover the entire price for the reconstruction. Do you think they kind of sneak a little in to the state for this reason to help the people who aren't able to work?
I wouldn't be surprised, but if the feds don't, I think the state will.
Hmm.
So that would be my prediction. But the feds have their budget issues, and so does the state. But I would be optimistic that over time it will get resolved. But there will be people who will miss paychecks in the next couple weeks that will
So
be rebuilt.
unfortunate.
Yeah, that can't be helped.
So, can you actually give me another example of like a local industry that would be impacted by this?
Well, sure. I mean, consider the cruise terminal right next to the Fort McHenry Tunnel.
Hmm.
The state's been very successful with cruises like Carnival, coming in and they go down the bay and go to Bermuda, the Bahamas, whatever. So any ship that's out now certainly can divert to Norfolk on the way back. But until the channel is open for shipping, all cruises will be canceled. So that affects flights into BWI. It affects people staying at hotels downtown. So the local hospitality industry will be affected. It really is a broad impact. It just shows the ripple effect
Hmm.
of trade in goods and services.
Yeah, you mentioned the Carnival Cruise Line. I saw something that said like there are ships that, can't come in, so these people have to fly back in those situations. And for people who have already planned trips outside of like leaving the Port of Baltimore, what happens then? Are they just completely canceled, like you mentioned, or is there a way to like divert it to a different port?
Well, Carnival will certainly accommodate people who are already on the water somewhere and get them back to Baltimore by bus or something. So, but the problem is for future trips,
Mm.
anyone who had plans to go in or out of Baltimore, for sure that will be put on hold. And I don't know how that means rebooking flights. And it will be a big headache for those travelers and for the company and for anyone supporting the tourism industry.
It's the same for people who use the Key Bridge every day just for a basic commute. It's going to put extra pressure on, what is that, 695, because it's no longer a loop now. Is that going to create, aside from traffic, is that going to create more issues for, I guess, pressure to expand the highways even more?
Well, I think it takes a long. Probably you could rebuild a bridge quicker than you could expand a highway. But you're exactly right about the traffic. Not even counting the inconvenience for people, commuting for work or for their daily business. One of the reasons and justifications for the Key Bridge in the first place is that it's been deemed unsafe to take certain types of commercial traffic through the Fort McHenry Tunnel.
Hmm.
So those trucks and whatnot will have to go all the way around the rest of the beltway, around 695. That will add to traffic congestion and time and carbon emissions for the trucks. And so that part of logistics will be with us for years to come, and no doubt unavoidable.
I saw the video of it, and the vessel lost power twice before it hit. What does this say about the shipping industry as a whole and like the maintenance of their ships that come into play?
Well, we've all seen the video where the ship lost power, and
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to know exactly what happened there, and I won't speculate on that.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I think, a freak accident, though. I'll mention there have been something like 18 incidents of ships or barges hitting bridges in the U.S. in the last 40 years. So there is always something that can go wrong. I mean, for example, in the case of the Key Bridge, they had special structures called dolphins, which are basically pilings put together with concrete to slow down. It's like a bumper to stop a vessel from hitting
Mm-hmm.
the main support. In this case, the ship actually came in at an angle because it lost control and missed the dolphin and hit the piling head on near the worst possible thing. So it's unfortunate you can't anticipate every possible type of failure happening.
Right.
You can't put dolphins up in front of every single piling of every support of every bridge. Newspaper reports have noted that the ship had another incident. It ran into a dock in Antwerp, Belgium, some years ago. Again, that was, I don't think it's not related, but it's curious.
Yeah.
So the Dolly had been cruising for 200,000 miles already, so it's not like it was just a beginner. It certainly appears it's not the fault of the pilot
Right.
on board. Will there be better inspections?
Mm-hmm.
I would think so. We'll have to wait the report of the National Transportation Safety Board to see what failed and why. Their ships do sink. The ships have mechanical failures. It certainly highlights the need for more care in inspections, and I'm sure the industry will react, and the insurance industry will require it.
Right. You mentioned these dolphins. This is the first I've ever heard of them. It seems like a really smart idea, but do you think with this situation happening that they'll redesign or take a different approach, considering there was a way for it to get past?
Yes and no. You raise an important question. So the ships that are being built today are much bigger than the ships that were underway 50 years ago
Mm-hmm.
when the Key Bridge was built, which means that a bigger ship has more momentum, and therefore a dolphin, the device intended to slow down or stop a ship, would need to be bigger to accommodate that. So I think that's, you can't fault the people in 1970 for not realizing how big ships would come.
Right.
On the other hand, you can't anticipate that the ship's going to come from every possible angle. That's a strange thing. Looking, if you compare this incident with the incident others would be aware of, the Tampa Bay Bridge was struck by a ship in 1980. It collapsed and killed a bunch of people. In that case, the channel was actually on a curve, so it really was a more dangerous situation. Here in Baltimore, the channel is straight.
Mm-hmm.
So that was designed right. The channel had been dredged recently. It was the proper depth. And if a ship runs off course, how do you...
You can't account for that.
And even if so, taking this exact case into example, suppose you had bigger dolphins around the main piers. If the ship had veered to the right instead of to the left, it could have taken out a smaller pier, which would have knocked down a smaller section. It wouldn't have been catastrophic, but anyone who was on the pier, on the bridge, would have been killed. So the bottom line is, in this type of thing, you cannot anticipate every possible thing that can go wrong. I think you can make things safer, but you can't make them completely safe.
Yeah, it was just definitely a bit jarring to see how easily it just collapsed just from that one hit.
But that's the way the whole thing is designed. It was being held up by that tower. You take the tower away, it falls down. And we've all played the game where you have a tower of wooden blocks, and you keep
Jenga.
pulling them out until the thing falls down. There's that last one that's doing all the work. You pull it out, the thing falls down. Well, those towers were doing all the work. There's two towers. If you took out either tower, for sure that bridge is going to fall down the way it did. that was completely expected from an engineering perspective.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you on. And of course, thank you so much for tuning in. Please visit the World Trade Center Institute online at WTCI.org for more insights, events, and opportunities. And make sure you follow us on all social channels at WTC Institute. See you next week.